The wind beyond the wall seldom blew so hard that it seemed to steal not only the warmth of a man but his memory of it. Yet tonight it scoured the stone ramparts of Eastwatch by the sea until the garrison looked carved out of breath and hoarfrost. Jon stood on the high platform where new ice had eaten the old, gloved hands clasping the rough timber rail, salt and frost crusting his beard. The sea took the moonlight like a blade takes the wet, glittering with a cold promise. Far out past the headland, the water had grown sluggish and patchy with flows, as if the sea itself were learning to remember winter. Behind him, the dragons stirred. He felt them before he heard them, the drag of air being gathered by vast lungs, the faint rasp of scaled bellies turning on stone, a wakefulness that pressed at the back of his mind the way the smell of rain presses at a field's patience. Rhaegal shifted, green shadow in a score of darker shadows, nostrils limned with vapor. Drogon, black and red, sprawled like a fallen mountain and raised his head, one ember eye opening. Viserions' pale hide caught the moon in polished bone. They were restless. Even a man who knew nothing of them could feel it. If the dragons were the children of fire, even fire had nerves. He had resisted the pull for days. He had argued with Daenerys until both of them had to turn away from the sight of the other, because duty hurt worst when it wore the face you craved. But news from Tormund's scouts had kept coming, ragged and urgent, the shape of a host moving through the wild, of dead marching along a frozen river where the hound's fire-painted vision had seen them. The others were going. Gendry with his hammer, Beric with his sword of stubborn light, the hound with a curse for a prayer, Yora and Thuras and Tormund with their old scars and laughless jests. They would bring back a white, they said, carry it south in chains and force a queen to sea. It should have been him and him alone, but the weight of a crown made by other people's need sat oddly on a man's shoulders. He could not leave the wall as light as he wished. But there was another way to be where he was needed, and sometimes being of the blood of dragons meant you stopped pretending your veins ran to water. You should not do this, Tyrion had said, shivering in more layers than looked possible on one small frame, breath fogging like a kettle. Or, if you must, find the luck of a song and do it later. Popular heroes tend to die early when they try to be the first chapter and the last. I've never cared for songs, Jon had said. And I don't mean to be a hero. You mean to be a fool. The words had no venom. Tell me it's not the same thing in the cold. Daenerys had said very little. She stood with her hands clenched into the sleeves of her coat, watching the glide of moonlight on Rhaegal's shoulder and the steam of his breath hang and curl. Her teeth sunk barely into her lower lip in a way that would have been childish in anyone less queenly. Promise me, she said at last, that you will make the right choice if it becomes a choice between saving yourself and saving your pride. Jon had thought of a burned boy he had carried from the pyre, and of a bastard solitude, and of the snow that fell on Winterfell when he was small, and nodded. He didn't know if he had the right to make promises to a woman who had spent her life clambering out of the promises of others, but he made this one anyway. I will make the right choice. He put his hand on Rhaegal's neck. The dragon's scales were rough as river rock and warm as a hearth when embers still hid below the ash. The heat went into Jon like a draught of good wine after fasting. Rhaegal's head dipped, and there was a sound in the dragon's chest that was more felt than heard, a deep grating that made the teeth ache. Jon's palm pressed harder, fingertips finding the ridged seam where green scale met golden horn. I am not your mother, he said under his breath. He didn't know if dragons knew human words. He suspected they knew things humans had forgotten. But I am not your enemy. Let me borrow your back. The first time he had come close to him, the dragon had snarled and fanned his wings and spat a tongue of fire that had emptied Eastwatch's yard. This time, Rhaegal merely blinked. The yellow eye, slit with a knife's edge of black, was a coin turned in a street magician's hand and shown to be something else entirely. A long tongue licked the sharp of a tooth. The dragon's wings twitched like a horse's skin when a fly walked across it. Daenerys stepped forward and laid her hand on Rhaegal's flank, inches from Jon's. She had ridden Drogon the way a storm rides a cliff, without asking if the cliff consents. Yet now there was a care to her touch that had not been there when she first climbed a saddle that was not a saddle. He will take you, she said. How do you know? Because he's waiting, And he isn't patient. They rigged straps hastily. Leather and rope brought from ships, doubled and doubled again until the fastenings looked like something a hard wind would laugh at. Yora set his jaw and made 3 in a row as if tying them were a penance. He had the deftness of men who've had to bind wounds. Tormund checked the lines with skeptical fingers. "If he throws you," the wildling said, "I'll say it was your idea." "It is my idea." "Then I'm glad you've had at least one bad one." Tormund's grin was a pale crack in frost. "Come back, Crow. You still owe me an explanation for liking women with too many teeth." Jon swung up with more awkwardness than grace. The straps bit his legs. His hands found ridges that weren't meant to be hands equivalent of stirrups. Rhaegal's muscles flexed under him, and some deep animal part of Jon, born of wolves and winter and the surety that anything larger than you can swallow you, wanted to scramble back down. He held on. The dragon's spine felt as if it had been shaped for high. After all, not with comfort but with inevitability. The moment Rhaegal gathered his legs beneath him and leaped, a gasp went from the garrison to the sea. Jon didn't hear it through the rush of air and the tearing of their ascent. The first beat of the dragon's wings was a hammer that rang his bones. Then the second and third hammered him into a pattern that he could bear. The night broke below them. Eastwatch fell away like a toy forged by a child with more ambition than talent. The sea unrolled with a dull gleam, and the shoreline pulled into a slow curve. The wall to the west looked less like a work of men than a thing that had always been there and would outlast anything men tried. Jon kept low on the dragon's neck, cheeks and eyes stung to tears by the cold. The wind was a blade, but the heat from Rhaegal's back was a blanket thrown over him. Under him muscles worked in great cables, each movement a tide. The dragon's wings sounded like a banner in a gale. If the banner were the size of a village, they slid into the north. He had traveled beyond the wall more times than he could count and always felt the same unwelcome. Here the world was honest in its refusal. The living had to fight for every breath and then be suspected of theft by the next breath. Tonight the stars were brittle and innumerable, the aurora a low smear to the east like a candle tipped, green catching in Jon's eyes as if the dragon's color had seeped into the sky. Below, the land showed itself in the faintest of contrasts. Stone like darker ice, ice like paler stone. He could see the silvered line of a river, frozen and overblown with snow, winding northward. That was the river from the Hound's vision, if he believed in a drunken cynic's sight. But it wasn't the river that drew him. It was movement. A dark ripple moved against the lighter dark. The ripple had a rhythm he knew too well already. The tide of a mass of bodies walking with no breath in them. A shiver that was not a shiver. Shadows within the shadow, white limbs flailing, heads lolling with the grotesque peace of men who do not know their names. He had watched them at Hardhome until he had not been able to draw his breath without tasting ash and fear. He had watched a man rowing a boat too slowly and watched that slowness pull other men into death. The host stretched far along the river's western bank, using the ice like a road. He could see the glitter of frozen armor lower down, white walkers on dead horses like statues dragged from a cold cathedral. Above those, on a hummocked ridge where a few trees had grown and died, the snow was smooth and untrodden. Then it was not. The one who led them, Jon had no better name for him than the Night King, and even that felt like a name a child would give to a story he wanted to be less true, crested the ridge on a pale horse. Rime had formed on the creature's mane. It shook and dusted the air with glitter. The rider's head turned. Jon could not see an expression. There was none to see, but he felt the turning like a touch on the back of his neck. Rhaegal hissed, and the hiss was a coal thrown into a pail of water. The dragon dove without being asked. The host flurried like something struck by a wind that only it felt. Whites raised their arms toward the dark. Dozens had no fingers to lift. The walkers did not scatter, but their horses' heads went up as beasts' heads do when their world changes. The Night King reached behind him and drew a shape as stark as a winter tree without leaves. A spear made of ice so translucent that the stars were bent oddly through it. Jon's mouth filled suddenly with metal taste. There was a distance at which you knew you could be killed, and he felt himself cross it as one would a step in a house he had walked blindfolded since childhood. "Down," he said, and Rhaegal laughed smoke. The dragon's neck flexed with a power it took Jon a heartbeat to predict. They banked, and the ground jumped up. He thought he felt the hairs on his wrist singe as green fire tore across the river's bank and 1,000 whites became black, twisting, collapsing things, snow pluming above them as if the fire had burned smoke into the cold itself. A walker's horse shrieked, unnatural and full of suggestion, its legs flailing and its rider thrown clear, unmarked by flame but cut from his mount. Rhaegal tore across the ridge like wind through wheat. Jon had a dragonglass spear strapped along his leg. He tore it free and felt foolish for thinking he could throw it from a dragon's back as if he were a child in a harvest field. But one of the blue-eyed riders wheeled his horse to charge, and folly became aim. Jon hurled. The spear flew like truth flies when the time for lying has passed. It struck the walker under the collarbone. For a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the walker bloomed into shards like breaking glass, the light in him going out with the delicate sound of a crystal goblet dragged along a table's edge. All across the nearest ranks of whites' bodies halted and fell as if strings had been cut. Rhaegal roared. A sound of delight, maddened and pure. They climbed. Jon didn't know if he meant to circle and strike again or if some animal instinct in him had shouted that they must put distance between themselves and that ice spear. He was glad for the distance when the night sang. The Night King's arm whipped, and the ice lance cut the air with a sound that wasn't sound. A sudden drop in all the warmth in Jon's body. It passed beneath Rhaegal's belly by what could have been inches or a mile. But whatever it was, Jon felt his soul count the missing measure. The spear struck the river beyond, and the ice heaved and cracked like an old man rising too quickly. Frost sprayed in a glittering fan. When the echo died, it left a silence the way a ripped seam leaves ribs showing. "Again," Jon said through chattering teeth. Rhaegal had already turned. The second pass was lower. The breath of the dragon's fire peeled hoarfrost from the stones as if revealing another season beneath. The walkers had drawn together now, a cluster of pale hard forms in the middle of ruined brush. The Night King did not move from his place. His head lifted to follow the dragon. His left hand opened in a lazy, almost indulgent way, fingers flexing as if he were tasting the heat on them and finding it a new wine. Jon had his gloved hand tight on the ridge of scale that served him for a pommel. He had no more dragonglass spear. He had long claw, and its Valyrian rippled steel had never felt heavier. He drew it, and the air tried to bite his hand off. "Down," he said again, but this time it was to himself. Rhaegal's wingtip grazed a stunted pine. It exploded into splinters. The dragon's shadow flung itself over the Night King. The fire arced. Jon saw the blue figure through the heat haze as a refraction, then as a certainty walking through flame that whirled around him without touching, and he felt his stomach understand something his head had not let itself fully think. That fire alone could not unmake the cold that had learned how to be a man. He saw movement to the left. Another walker, spear lifted. Jon's breath stopped. Then he acted because there was no other thing to do. He unhooked the strap that held his leg. He might have meant to leap, or Rhaegal might have bucked, or the world might have shifted its weight on some ancient fulcrum. He fell more than he sprang, and the hard crust of snow came up with a sting and a sudden absence of all the dragon's furious heat. He rolled, clutching long claw, and came to his feet half-winded, the scream of frost filling his lungs. Men who believed in gods prayed where they died. Jon had no time to pray. He ran. The walker to his left rode for him. Jon met the horse's head first, and Longclaw split it like rotten driftwood. The beast fell in a grotesque slow fold, its rider sliding from the saddle with a grace that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been wrong. The walker's blade hissed through the air. Longclaw met it. Frost crawled up the steel where they touched, and Jon's wrist barked its ache into his arm. He stepped right and turned left, bringing the rippled edge up under the thing's arm. The arm came away in a brittle spray. The walker turned to ice under the moon. Another was upon him. Jon didn't try to be a swordsman. He tried to be alive. He let the blade miss him by an inch, felt it whisper along his coat like a serpent, and slammed his shoulder into the walker's chest. It did not feel like a man's solidity. It felt like hitting a stone that had learned to love the shape of a man. He shoved with everything in him, his boots finding purchase in the crust. The walker stumbled. He brought Longclaw down in a two-handed sweep. Ice sprayed his face in sharp, stinging grains. 3 dozen whites dropped to the ground in jerks like fish dragged from the riverbank. In the corner of his eye Jon saw a motion in the middle distance, a shape like absolute winter take 3 long strides toward him in a way that made no mark on the snow. Rhaegal struck like a falling hill. The dragon's forelimbs slammed into the ground on either side of the Night King, claws punching through crust and packed powder, shoulders hunching. His head came down, jaws gaping, the flame geysering out. The Night King lifted his spear. It caught the light in a way that was not reflection so much as hunger. Jon moved because he had to. He scrambled up the dragon's foreleg, fingers slipping in the heat-slicked scales, hauled himself to the shoulder and slid back into the loose buckle of the strap, fumbling for the length he'd freed. Rhaegal's roar was fury and pain all tangled. The Night King's spear flew. It took Rhaegal low, along the line of his ribs. The sound he made then was a sound Jon would later try very hard to forget. It wasn't a roar so much as a ripping, as if something that had always been whole had been given back in pieces. Rhaegal lurched. Jon's vision filled with a sky that was the same color as his fear. The dragon beat his wings and faltered, beat them again and caught, and the world became motion without map. Jon clung, the strap cutting his palms through the glove. His legs clenched so hard he thought they might crack. Blood steamed along Rhaegal's side. The wound rhymed around. The dragon kept flying. They did not go far. Jon could taste iron now, and hair, and something like rotten cinnamon, dragon blood with heat and age in it. Rhaegal floundered, huffing. The ground was a white and gray blur. Then it steadied. He saw the river again. He saw the rank upon rank of dead. He saw the Night King below, a point of frozen certainty among their motion, the spear now a splinter in that certainty's logic. He put his feet on the ground and felt it give under him like a ship's deck. His legs trembled. He saw Daenerys, her face white chalk with 2 bright flags for cheeks and eyes black as the sea. Hey. He took a step and then another and met her in the middle. She touched his face with a hand that was shaking and very hot. "You're alive," she said. She sounded as if she were telling herself that her eyes were not lying. "So is he," Jon said, nodding back toward the northern darkness. "They're moving along the river. He's with them." Rhaegal's wound was deep but not mortal. Whether the dragon's life held because of some strength in him, or because life refused to leave any creature that went at death with that much rage, Jon could not say. The flesh around the wound was rimed and ugly, a white slew on green hide, and when the maester smeared it with hot pungent pastes, Rhaegal hissed and clamped his jaws until he split his own lip. He would not let anyone but Daenerys near him. She spoke low and in a tongue that had shepherded dragons before him, and Rhaegal's head lowered in grudging assent. Beric, Thuras, the Hound and the rest set out at dawn 2 days later, when the wind dropped to a mere misery and not an assertion. Jon was not among them, not because he loved them less but because he had taken his chance and used up the measure of luck a man can ask of a single winter. He watched them go with the same feeling with which he had watched ships he had sent out into bad weather. He told himself that because he had bought them a day, because the host of the dead had slowed and gathered along the river, there would be no lake to trap them. The world does not often reward bargains made with your own fear, but sometimes it relents. When the raven came back with Tormund's scrawl, "Caught one, river crossing, no lake, send fire if you can," Jon exhaled so harshly he tasted iron again. He took the message to Daenerys with a face he could not quite smooth into a king's, and she read it once and then once more, reading not the ink but the space around it. "We go," she said simply. They went on Drogon and Viserion. Rhaegal could not yet fly, not far, not well, and though the dragon had opened his mouth as if to take the sky out of spite, Daenerys put her brow to his and whispered some command that was also a plea. Jon watched her mount Drogon with a fluidity born of fearlessness and practice. He felt a strange pang, not jealousy, not even envy, but the wish to be all the things to all the people who demanded it of him. He settled instead for being the first thing to the only person who could breathe fire. They found the raiding party on a knuckled rise north of the river. 7 men ringed by the dead, their captive thrashing in bonds woven of rope and iron and determination. The dead were spreading, not converging. The lake had not formed as it had in Jon's worst imaginings. Instead, the pressure of tens of thousands of feet had made the river's ice seize and thin along the middle, a treacherous slick that swallowed the first ranks of whites unwary enough to press there. They were filling their own grave and making a bridge of bodies over it. The living held the high ground, and this time when Daenerys dropped from the sky, their flight was not a rescue so much as a scythe. Drogon's fire burned in a long, steady line. Viserion screamed his higher note and stitched fire with it. The whites went down like wheat flattened by storm. Jon rode with them because the idea of not going felt like a joke told too long. He bounded from the saddle of his wounded dragon's brother and hit the snow in a roll, coming up beside Tormund just in time to see the wildling slam his axe into the neck of something that had once been a woman with hair that snaked in black ribbons. Jon's sword, Longclaw, felt more certain for the work. He cut and stepped and cut again, the way he had learned on Castle Black's yard. Nothing fancy, because fancy is for men who think they will live to discuss it. The hound swore and fought like a man who had finally decided the hells were already here, and he could stop trying not to find them. Gendry grunted with each swing, sweat freezing at his temple like beads of glass. Beric's sword burned and sputtered and burned again. Thuras smiled at nothing, his lips blue and his eyes seeing an entirely different thing. Yora moved as if his sword were the last true thing left in him, and he would measure his manhood by it alone. They left with all of them alive and the white dragging its chain, shrieking whenever it saw the open sky. Jon did not allow himself to imagine it quieting in the hold by some trick of cold. He did not allow himself to imagine Cersei's face when it reached the capital. He imagined only Rhaegal, tethered in Eastwatch's yard and rumbling. They were halfway back when the storm boiled up along the northern horizon, a wall of dark like ink thrown into water and allowed to spread. Jon felt the hair on his neck prickle. He turned and saw, very far off, a figure on the ridge where he had first fallen. It stayed there, still and observing, and did not cast. They reached Dragonstone with the white in a cage that had once held fish by the hundreds and men by the tens, and the smell fouled the courtyard in a way that would not leave for days. Davos pinched his nose and quoted some onionish wisdom about bad air running before worse. Missandei stood far back, composed as always save for the grim line of her mouth. Tyrion watched the thing fling itself against the bars until its own bones protruded, and there was nothing clever in him to say. "If that does not convince a queen," he said at last. "She is not a queen but a problem." "She is both," Jon said. He thought of Cersei's green fires swallowing crowns and bells and men indiscriminately, and of children who grew into meanings they had never chosen. "We go to her and we show her and we hope she sees what is true and not what is useful." The dragon pit smelled of old bones and of the pride of men who had managed, once, to contain a thing that hated containing. Jon walked through it behind Daenerys, the white's cage dragged by 4M. With faces set like the edges of spades. The sand was wind-scored. Across the pit Cersei Lannister descended stairs in black so absolute it made the light around her grayer. Jaime walked at her side, jaw set like a wound and hair less gold by half than it had been when it dangled before a confused girl's face in a tower window. Euron came swaggering like a child who had stolen his first cup of wine and liked the taste so much he was sure it must always be his. The white did what whites do. It made a mockery of death in a way that turned even the bravest faces thoughtful. Sandor flipped the latch and dragged the thing forward on its chain, and it scrabbled for Cersei with a hunger it could not name. He severed it with a blow at the torso, and it kept reaching with half a body. Grey Worm stepped forward with a crate and kicked it open, and the dragonglass he and his soldiers had hauled like pennants gleamed dull and dark. Jon pulled a dagger from it and drove it into the white skull. The thing went still mid-snarl. Silence spilled after it like relief. They made their promises. They broke some before they finished making them. Euron made a show of being frightened, and leaving that was very much a show. Cersei listened and lied better than anyone expected. For a moment Jon thought there might be a path that wound between pride and necessity, and then he saw the wall fall again in his mind, blue fire licking at ancient wards, and he set his mouth and said what he could not say. That he had bent the knee and meant it, that his word was a bond, not a coin to be flipped. The look Cersei gave him could have frozen a river. The truth changed less than men like to think it would change. It changed everything at the edges. By the time the first true assault came at Eastwatch by the Sea, Rhaegal's wound had healed into a furrow that would always be white against the green, a seam that caught the moon. The wall held like a mountain with law written into it. The sea was more ice than water now, the flows larger, the lanes between them narrower, but the water was still water, and the dead were still things that stumbled into it and did not come back out unless pushed from below by more dead. The Night King brought his host as far as he could bring it along the coast, and then he tried for the castle. Giants came first, their bones wrapped with broken chains and their eyes emptier than caves. They carried tree trunks hacked to ugly staves and beat at the gate until it boomed, and men behind it put their backs to it and spoke to each other in voices that pretended not to be frightened. The dead flowed in waves, faceless and many, and climbed over their own. Eastwatch's scorpions thrummed in a way that made the teeth of the men who aimed them ache. Gendry had labored in the forges at Dragonstone for weeks, the hammer's rhythm a song he had known since he was small, and the bolts now shone with obsidian heads fletched with goose feather. They flew and took walkers from their saddles and turned them to crystal snow. Every time one shattered, a section of the horde collapsed like a shelf of ice calving into the sea. The walkers learned and spaced themselves, cold minds adapting with a patience that made courage feel like a brittle thing. Bran's ravens were everywhere. They poured from the woods inland and became a cloud over the battlefield. He sat by Winterfell's dead hearths with his eyes rolled white and his mouth slightly open and saw everything at once. The blue constellations that were the walkers, the lines of force in the host like currents in the sea, the cold knot at its center where nothing living could look without wanting to turn away. Sansa watched him with a face that had bled beyond too many masks to own anyone. When he spoke, the voice was not a boy's voice but an instrument that had learned only one note. He's testing the ice at the mouth of the bay. He wants to force it to carry weight it shouldn't carry. He is patient enough to wait years if he must. But he will not wait that long. What does he want? She asked. What he has always wanted. She understood that to mean everything that lives. The second day the storm came. The sky low, the light green with the promise of terrible weather. Wind off the water that felt like knives slipped between armor plates. The dead pressed at the base of the wall, and men poured fat and pitch and oil and fire like a blessing on them. Fire did not run up ice well. It ran down into the dead and made a noise like 1,000 sighs, and for each white that fell there were 20 to climb over it. The walkers moved carefully. They had learned the scorpions. They moved out of sight, then into, then out again, maddening as fish on a line that are not quite hooked. On the third day, Daenerys flew. Drogon was a thunderhead given talons. Viserion, pale and bright, hummed the air as if joy and fury were the same thing and he had a belly full of both. Rhaegal refused to be left behind. His wound gave him a list that would have been comical if it were not brave. He took the air with a growl that sounded like a man with a knife in him deciding to dance anyway. Jon climbed up behind Daenerys. Davos had asked him why, and Jon had said only, "Because if she falls I will catch her," knowing full well that there was no catching a falling queen from the back of a dragon. He knew, too, that the heart does not make its reasons in the language of clever men. They swept along the wall and banked out over the frozen margin of the sea. From above, the host of the dead was a smear of dirt on a white page. Jon saw the walkers' formations as men who have lived too long with war learned to see formations even in a flock of birds. He saw the Night King. He was far back this time, at the edge of a copse that had once been pine and was now a tangle of ice-colored trunks. He lifted his head and the wind sharpened. The ravens scattered and reformed. Jon felt a pressure in his chest that was not fear but a prelude to it. The way a man's shadow looks different when a cloud goes across the sun. He tapped Daenerys's arm. She did not need the signal. She had already turned. They drove straight at him. Drogon's fire spread in a fan that would have burned a city bare. The flame roared and curled and was beautiful. It washed around the Night King without a mark. Daenerys banked at the last instant and climbed, body low against the scales. One hand fisted around a ridge as surely as a rider grips reins. Jon's breath came fast. He felt the quiver of muscle under her and the jump in her shoulder when Viserion's scream pitched up riskily high. The pale dragon dove. He spitted a line of walkers farther down, catching one and then another with precise bursts until 4 had turned to fragmented ice. Their whites fell like the spokes of a broken wheel. The Night King lifted his hand and the air went thinner. "He's calling the storm," Jon shouted. He could feel it in his teeth, a dry tension, like wind before a door is thrown open. "We have to take him now." "How?" Daenerys's tone was the tone of a woman who would do it regardless. He had no elegant answer. "Bring me close." She brought him close. It was not in her nature to hesitate. Drogon dropped with a will that cared nothing for prudence. Rhaegal came to the other side, a green wedge. Viserion climbed and fell away, circling like a white hawk. The Night King stood with his blue cohort gathered behind him. His spear glittered. The storm poured along the line of the bay like a cloak being shaken out. Jon unbuckled the strap that bound his leg. He put a hand to Daenerys' shoulder, and she turned her face toward him without taking her eyes off the ground. He looked into her eyes for a moment so long it could have been a life. Then he let go and went down. He hit snow. He felt the bite of ice through fur and leather. He rolled and came up as the nearest walker drove his blade where his neck had been. Longclaw rose to parry, and its weight was a friend's hand in his. Rhaegal crossed low and raked with a wingtip, knocking the walker sideways. Jon stepped in and cut, the motion all hips and shoulder. Let the blade's own keen do the work. It chipped into the walker's neck. He wrenched it free and cut again. The walker made a tinkling sound and came apart. The Night King turned his head toward Jon. There is a distance at which a man knows his place in the world. Jon had spent a life negotiating his. He had bent his knee and stood up again, put his hand on wolf and woman, on crown and stick and sword. Here, before that blue gaze, he felt reduced to the 2 or 3 things he had always been. The son of a sister who was not a sister, the brother of a wolf, the man with a blade that could make ice into truth. The Night King did not rush. He did not draw a blade. He opened his hands. The dead around him jerked as if strings had been pulled lightly. Their heads turned. The storm surged. Jon moved forward because he did not know how to do anything else and because sometimes courage is only a refusal to imagine being elsewhere. He lifted Longclaw. The Night King's spear flew for Daenerys. She had known it would. Drogon contorted in a way that made Jon's stomach turn. A wing flung up, a shoulder presented, the spear clipping along scale with a shriek and then biting, blood as dark as old wine spatting the snow far below. Drogon screamed. A sound that made 1,000 men flinch and hundreds of dead pause, as if stillness had been shot through them. The dragon's wing sagged. He did not fall. He clung to the air like a thing that had decided it would, by force of will if by no other physics. Jon was between storms then. He drove forward with a sudden clarity, as if the world had chosen for him the single line he could follow. A walker tried to skewer him. He met the spear with Longclaw's edge and ran up the shaft as berserkers had run up oars in the old songs, not thinking of glory but of balance. He left the walker behind him a spray of crystals. He gained the hummock where the Night King stood. The air was colder there, not as men mean cold, colder in the way truth is cold. Your breath felt your lungs and decided it might prefer to live elsewhere. Jon did not pause to admire the fear. He lunged. The Night King stepped aside with a fluidity that said nothing about grace and everything about inevitability. Jon had never been a dancer. He had fought men who were better than he was by remembering that better men died the same way. He feinted with a slash that would have decapitated something with a pulse and brought the blade around low, aiming for the knee. The Night King lifted his leg as if the world had always been planning to have him do that. Jon would have died then, if he had been fighting a man. Rhaegal hit the ground behind him in a skid and rolled his shoulder into the Night King like a warhorse used to trampling. The impact made a sound like ice rending under a sled. The Night King stumbled a half-step, an admission not of weakness but of physics. Rhaegal's head came low and his jaws closed. Teeth that had crushed stone came together around air that had learned to pretend to be a king. The dragon shook empty air. The Night King slid aside again, with a sidestep that would have been comic on any other figure. Neither graceful nor clumsy, simply correct. Jon threw himself at his back. Longclaw slid along armor that looked like plate and felt like a wind you cannot push. He found, for an instant, a soft place. If there is such a thing as softness in pure winter, he found it. The blade bit. The Night King turned. There are men who, when struck, make a sound. The Night King made none. He turned with the same terrible calm and drove his hand out, fingers like stilettos of ice. They struck Jon hard high in the side under his ribs, through leather and mail and fur and into skin. The pain was white, a new color. And he felt his breath leave him like a child who had been told it was time to run to a new life and did not want to move. He staggered, not letting go of the sword, and brought it up by brute stubbornness. The Night King's other hand lifted toward Rhaegal, fingers spreading. A shape moved at the edge of Jon's sight. Tormund's axe took the wrist of the walker who had come up to support his king. The hand spun away like a slow bird and fell, fingers crackling, and the walker cracked in two. Behind Tormund, the hound came, both hands on a dragonglass-dipped pike he had stolen from a scorpion mount, teeth bared like a dog about to vomit. He drove the pike toward the Night King's knee. The Night King turned that calm gaze on him and stepped aside, and the hound's momentum brought him to his knees in the snow. Then Yora was there, sword bringing sparks against ice, his breath a ragged song. He had no illusions of triumph on his face. He had duty. The Night King moved between them as if he were water and they were clutter. He kicked Yora's ankle out. He brought his hand down toward the hound's throat. He looked up and met Jon's eyes again, almost idly. Jon pulled the dragonglass knife he had at his belt. It was not elegance. It was not prophecy. It was simply that he had run out of long options. He plunged forward through the ribboning pain in his side and drove the dark glass toward the place where Longclaw had bitten. It went in. There was no scream. There was no dramatic shudder. The Night King stopped moving. Jon had a moment to think. Have I missed? Then the world changed temperature. It is a strange thing for the weather to make a glass sound. The sound went through Jon like thirst. The Night King looking at him was first stillness, then fracture. The blue of his eyes cracking like enamel in heat, the skin crazing into 1,000 perfect white lines, the armor going spiderwebbed and then powdered. He came apart the way a pond does when men throw rocks until a hole opens in the middle. He became 1,000 shards, then 100, then none. Where he had stood, the snow had fallen flatter, as if something heavy had been lifted off it. A breath went through the host of the dead like a thought passing through a crowd. They began to fall. Some did not. The White Walkers that had been far enough away to be their own centers of gravity staggered like men who had woken from a dream they had not expected to reach the end of. They turned and ran like cold animals into colder woods. Most of the Whites collapsed. They fell forward or backward, into each other, into the wall of the bay, into the gaps between ice and water. The sound of falling bodies was a ruined harvest. Jon stood with the knife in his hand and Longclaw drooping toward the snow and felt suddenly the shape of his own body, as if he had been living in it accidentally all his life. He would have fallen except that Rhaegal's head came down like a curved cliff to hold him up, and he leaned on horn and scale as if they were a great green rock that had always been there for him. He put his other hand on the dragon's face and felt it hot and alive and good. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, Daenerys was landing in the blowing snow, Drogo staggering with one wing ragged with blood and his sides working like a bellows. She slid from the saddle before the dragon had fully settled and came toward Jon stumbling. For once not in control of the way her feet broke the earth. She reached him and struck him on the chest with both fists, a light, helpless, laughed-out strike that dissolved into a grasp. She put her forehead to his and drew breath like a drowning woman delivered to air. "You promised," she said, and then, muffled, "I did not ask you to promise this." He thought he should say something clever or kind, something kingly. He said instead, "It worked." In the days that followed, men who had been born to winters and those who had never seen one learned together how to outlast a weather that was suddenly less purposeful. The dead lay thick along the foot of the wall where the wind piled them like leaves. They would not rise. Men who had been on the edge of breaking bent and picked them up and carried them to the pits and burned them anyway, because the memory of being hunted does not leave quickly. Tormund slept in a storeroom with a dozen others and snored like a bear and woke with tears frozen to his beard, and would not say if they were for the dead, or the living, or the way his body had remembered warmth. The hound made a great show of complaining about the cold and then went outside alone and stood with his back to the wall, as if he could find something in himself there worth warming. Beric drank his wine more slowly, as if giving each swallow its due. Thuras laughed and told the same 3 bad jokes and then sat quiet, and in the morning they found him smiling still, his body finally deciding to stay where it had always tried to run. Gendry hammered careful rings of dragonglass for arrows that would never need to be used and found in the rhythm a piece that his father had not known to look for. Yora wrote a letter and folded it with sure hands and did not send it to anyone. Bran wrote to Jon, "I saw it. You did not kill the winter. You killed the way it had learned to walk." Sansa wrote to Jon, "The men of the north will make something of this. Make sure it is something they can live with." Arya sent nothing. She came to Eastwatch instead. The others arrived with her, Winterfell's banners bristling like the bramble on the moors. She stepped onto the yard and looked at the dragons and did not take a step back. She looked at Jon's side where the bruises still bloomed and said, "You were always the stubborn one," and then hugged him harder than a small body should be able to. He laughed, and the laugh hurt, and he did not mind. When he pulled back, she had the Valyrian dagger she had been given by a boy who was not a boy. In her belt, she touched it, her eyes were winter clear. "I thought it might be me," she said quietly, matter of fact. "But I like that it was you. I like that it was anyone," he said. "I like that it is done." "Is it done?" she asked, and they both looked north as if the answer was a bird that might be crossing the sky. The wall stood. It stood with a sense of reprieve that made its shadow feel different on the ground. In King's Landing, Cersei paced in a dress like an insult and made plans that were only plans and found that even men who enjoyed being lied to want to be lied to by someone whose lies have teeth. Jaime left her. He did it silently and with a sword on his hip and with the look of a man who had heard something inside him break and was listening to the shape of the pieces. Euron sailed and found nothing on the sea worth conquering but his own noise. In the Stormlands, lords who had packed their halls with salted meat listened to the wind and, finding it less angry, sent their men out into it again. In Old Town, maesters looked at the sky as if it had insulted their chains by changing. Jon went back to Winterfell with Daenerys when the ice turned to water in Black Lanes, and the sea's smell came like a memory of something a man could need. They rode through the neck where the reeds whispered secrets to no one, and along the King's Road where the heads on spikes had been replaced long ago by empty air that reminded men's eyes. The dragons flew above them, not in a threat but in a fact. People rolled from their huts and fields to stare. Some clasped hands. Some spat for luck. A few knelt, too many too openly. "Will it be easier?" Daenerys asked one night when the fire burned blue at its base and the stew was thin with the ends of old stock and beginnings of new meat. "No," Jon said honestly, "but it will be this, and that is enough." He thought of the Night King's eyes going to frost cracks and of the feel of Rhaegal's hide beneath his hand and of the warmth that had come back to the wind in the days since and felt a quietness he had not thought belonged to him. At Winterfell the gods would accepted them without fuss. The heart tree's face was as it had always been. Solemn, a little sad, perhaps amused at men's pride. Bran sat under it and lifted his eyes to his sister and his brother and his queen and seemed to find them all expected. "You flew where ravens fly," he said to Jon. "It felt like falling," Jon said. He looked up, toward the snow-heavy branches and the small spaces between them where stars made themselves known. "And then it felt like landing. Most things do." Bran touched the bark with pale fingers. "You should know who you are matters as much as what you have done. And what you have done is yours." Jon stood very still. He had known for months and not known. He had fought with the knowledge and shoved it aside with work and with cold and with the immediacy of need. The words came now not like a blow but like the dropping of a weight he had been bearing with arms too stubborn to admit they were tired. "Whatever I am still me," he said finally. "Yes," Bran said. And his smile was deep winter in which something green had managed to grow. In the weeks that followed, the North breathed. Men threshed the snow from roofs in a way that implied expectation rather than defiance. Women measured out seed and found that their hands shook less when they thought of planting and more when they thought of telling stories. Children made games that did not involve running screaming from their friends while pretending to be blue-eyed. Grey Worm drilled the Unsullied in a yard that smelled of horse and old blood, and the sound of their pikes striking in unison became the yard's heartbeat. Missandei stood by a window and learned the word for thaw in 3 northern dialects and liked each one better than the last. Tyrion found a smile that looked like it might be permanent, and then ruined it with a sentence that petered out through his nose when he could not help but be himself. Davos salted fish and made friends with women who had never seen the sea and then saw it and were unimpressed. Jorah leaned a little on his left leg and did not mention it and wrote a second letter and burned it. Rhaegal took the sky again with no list and a habit of turning his head toward the north, as if remembering pained him and he kept prodding the tooth. Viserion learned the taste of clouds. Drogon slept a great deal, as if setting down the weight of having held a spear in his body had left him lighter and heavier at once. When they flew over the winter fields, the shadows they made were not Dread's shadows. They were Aw's. The next spring came because it does, regardless of whether men think it will. They went south because the world makes kings and queens explain themselves before it allows them to live quietly. They went not because they wanted to sit on chairs with claims, but because those chairs kept making claims on everyone else. The dragon pit did not feel less a ruin the second time. Cersei's absence made it stranger. She held court now in rooms that used to smell of better decisions and found that the world did not snap to her quick as it had. She sent emissaries with words that sounded like capitulation and were nothing of the kind. Jon watched Daenerys listen with careful, sun-chosen stillness and say no, because everyone deserved more than what one woman would let them have. There were battles. They were not the battles men had feared. They were not at the end of the world, but in its crooked middle. At river fords, and in market squares, and under the shade of oaks that had grown there for a lifetime and would fall in a day to feed machines of war. Jon learned again how to stand where he was needed and be struck without striking back more than he had to. Daenerys learned to modulate fire, to burn siege towers and spare cities, to hear the lines in which people would think of her and draw them softer. Tyrion coaxed lords into agreements that left them feeling clever and left their people fed. Sansa wrote letters and made them chains when they needed to bind men to promises and ribbons when they needed to dress bargains as gifts. Arya went where she pleased and came back with knives clean and weirwood leaves in her hair. Bran sat and watched and told them where to be, not because he wanted to be a god but because it was the best use of a boy who had no other use now. Sometimes Jon woke in the dark of pre-dawn and felt the shape of a cold hand at his ribs and remembered that there are debts the living pay to the dead by living. He turned and found heat. Daenerys's shoulder under his mouth, the place where her pulse spoke. Sometimes she woke with a sharp breath and reached for the place where her dragon had been wounded and found only skin. They did not speak of it incessantly. They knew better than to turn a scar into a shrine. But they also knew not to lie to the people they were when there were no people within hearing. By the time the capital fell, it did not fall. It moved. People in the streets had been choosing for months, in the way they looked at soldiers and at bread, in the way they opened their doors and shut them. The city did not shudder under fire that time. Beside, it let in a wind from the river that smelled of tannery and magnolia. Cersei was borne away not by dragon but by the consequences she had postponed and postponed until they crowded into her. Jaime's last act was to lift his hand with no sword in it and offer it not to a queen but to a woman. She did not take it, and he lowered it with dignity and walked into a future that was smaller and kinder and harder. Qyburn died squinting at a mechanism that had betrayed him, more interested in the latch than in his own breath. Euron died making a joke he didn't think was funny and laughing anyway. They called Daenerys queen because she was... They called Jon something they could not settle on. He had no taste for a word that made the air in a room go thinner. He stood beside her and felt that his place was not beside her as a shadow but as a man with a will parallel to hers, and she felt it too. When they set their seals to decrees, they did so with the knowledge that 1,000 people they would never meet would live a little differently because of the curl of a letter. They did not pretend that would always be good. Once, in the quiet between councils, Daenerys went to the yard where the dragons slept in their domed nests, and Jon found her there with her hand on Rhaegal's old scar. "He took you where you needed to be," she said. "He chose, and you chose, and the world changed its mind about what it thought it was required to do." Jon thought of a day when the wind had frozen his lungs and blue eyes had been the last thing a man should see, and he had seen them and lived. He put his hand on hers, on scale, on the seam that would outlast him. "We were lucky," he said. "We were brave," she said. "We were both." He paused. "We will need both again." The year the snows melted earliest in living memory. The green in the north came up in a rush as if the earth had been waiting only for permission. Men went into the woods with axes with new handles and came out with beams and stories. Women turned soil and found last year's seeds willing. Children laughed at puddles and learned that even dragons are not scary if you have seen them yawn. Ghost returned one morning without ceremony, shoulders thicker, one ear torn. He walked to Jon and put his head against his chest, and Jon buried his hands in the direwolf's coat and realized that his heart had been looking for this shape without admitting it. The letters piled on Tyrion's table were lighter. The wine was better. The old gods kept their secrets. On a morning so clear it could have been washed, Jon went to the top of the wall. It was smaller now that he had learned to look at it directly. He stood and looked north and saw not a threat but a distance. The air tasted of salt and cold stone. He could hear below the rattle of harness and the distant, ordinary clatter of a kitchen that had not had to salt its meat for a siege that week. He looked up and saw 3 dragons carving lanes in a sky that had once been closed to everyone but birds and the gods. He felt a hand slip into his and did not flinch at that familiarity. Daenerys stood beside him with her hair curled by damp and her cheeks pink and the lines at the corner of her eyes that came when she smiled. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had done nothing?" she asked. "I try not to," he said, but he thought of a lake that had not formed, of a spear that had hit and not killed, of the way a dragon's breath had lit 100 bodies into a kind of horrible redemption. He thought of the Night King's eyes cracking, of the sound the world had made when the cold's idea of itself had broken. "Sometimes," he admitted, "sometimes I think about how close we were." She squeezed his hand. "We will always be close, to the end of the world and to the beginning of the next." He looked north. He looked south. The wind came off the sea and moved his hair the way a hand moves the hair of a child with love and impatience in it. He smiled, and when he did it felt like coming in from the yard to a door that had been left open on purpose. He had promised to make the right choice, and somewhere along the way he had, and the world had accepted that choice and continued as worlds do, in a long, untidy persistence. When he closed his eyes, he saw green. Not dragon or fire exactly, something older that had chosen to be both. He thought of a young man who had put his hand on rough scale and said please, and of a beast that had answered in the only way it knew, and of the line that had been drawn since then through storm and fire and the coldest cold. He thought simply, "I am still her. Then he opened his eyes and let the world in.